Hey guys, how's it going? I was supposed to do a joke about BitConnect, so should I do it or not? What's up, what's up, what's up, what's up, BitConnect? So send me your money for my ICO and we'll raise like a couple of $1 million together. So this is pretty much a phishing attempt to get your money, which is some of the time that we're gonna discuss in this talk. So who am I? I work at Mandiant, a FireEye company. I'm doing red team, web application testing, internal, external, and stuff like that. I really enjoy writing assembly. Some people think I'm crazy because of that, but I guess I love it. Love to bypass stuff. So this is something that you have to do when you perform red team because your client may have security product on the way, so you have to figure out a way to go through them. I've been with the NorthSec for 4 years now. I'm a native French Quebecois, which explains my terrible accent. It's all actually my parents' fault, not mine, so blame them for that. What we're going to talk about today, the goal of a red team, because there's a lot of misconception about red team. Again, this is my personal opinion, so I could be wrong, you could be right. It's a question of point of view. Identifying your target. So when you're targeting a company, what we should do, and a couple of tricks to actually find interesting value that can really help you doing a red team. Phishing, so a couple of advice that I personally use when I perform phishing. Which kind of payload you should use in certain specific situation. And hunting, this is again not a complete things about red team because we don't have like 12 hours to talk about it. But I'll give you some of the tips that I personally use when I perform red team, and a couple of tools and tips at the end regarding red teaming. So first of all, goal of red team. Obviously, you want to assess your client responsiveness against threat actors. Usually, when you perform an internal penetration testing, you're going to run like an automated scan that's going to give you a big picture of everything they have in their network and a bunch of unpatched software and stuff like that. Usually, red teamers not going to run automated tools because we want to assess if they're able to actually detect us. So we're trying to be a bit more quiet over the network. So we provide different kind of feedback. Evaluating their security posture, we're usually going to define goals with the client. So access the CEO email, for example, getting domain admin access, or targeting specific application that contain like the real good asset, like customer information and stuff like that, right? And also trying to demonstrate the kind of path that an attacker can actually use to get access to this information, because most of the time we're going to define domain admin as a goal, but we don't necessarily need domain admin to actually get access to really valuable assets, right? What red team is not about? Exploiting as many ODA as possible. To me, a red team is most likely a sysadmin job. So you get your first foothold, then you just have to understand your environment and figure out who have the access to the specific application that you want to target, right? And then again, it's also not exploiting as much system as possible because you want to remain stealth. So sometimes I've conducted red team where I only had 2 shells for the whole things and it was enough to actually achieve all the goals. So that's perfect for you because you can remain pretty stealth. So if you make the analogy between internal testing and red team, internal testing most like Rambo, you're shooting everywhere and you're just trying to actually get shells everywhere. And it's usually a little bit more easier to get the main admin that way, but it's extremely noisy and it's not something that you can do when you perform red team. Red team is more like James Bond, you're more stealth, a little bit more sexy over the network. Usually your payload is going to be a bit more sophisticated than just like using your muscle to shoot everywhere. But the realist question, are we really sexy and stealthy as James Bond when we perform red team? We're going to discover that some of the techniques that we use are not necessarily as stealth as we thought, unfortunately. And that's one of the things that I want to address, just give you insight of trick that I use to actually be a bit more stealth. Unfortunately, there's no magic way to get data without being detected at some point, because that's how it works, right? You need to fetch data. So at some points, you need to establish connection to a specific service, at least. So let's move on to identify your target. First of all, you need a list of targets, right? So are you going to fish employees, specific type of employees? Let's say you're looking for an insurance company. Are you going to target the insurance claim guys that have limited access, or are you going to try to go to the manager or people with a little bit more privilege? It may be interesting because they may have specific program internally that can be used for a better phishing campaign, identifying their security product. Even if you don't have a foothold, there's sometimes some insight that you can get to actually identify this kind of information and pick the right phishing campaign for your target. We'll discuss about this a bit later. I'll give you a perfect example. This is actually a real screenshot from a real client. That was a fairly new company, so they didn't have much email that were leaked and data breach and stuff like that, which is a good place to find a couple of emails for your target company. However, they were really active on Facebook, so they were posting picture in their office with a bunch of people, and they tag every single employee on the picture. Finding the email pattern is usually something simple. You need to find one or two, and you're going to understand that this is their email pattern. So I basically crafted emails based on their name on Facebook. Again, bonus points, some of these people were actually putting their job on Facebook. So it was even easier for me to figure out that this person was an underwriter at the company or doing something else. So you can select your target more efficiently. So looking at Facebook is really a good idea if you're looking for a potential name for a specific company if you don't get much email through public channel. As I mentioned, searching publicly available password dump, like there's a couple of huge dump like Adobe, Ashley Madison, and a bunch of other in the past that can actually give you a bunch of email address that can be used. You don't really care about that, the password. You're mostly going to phish those people, right? So you just reuse this information. GitHub, you'll be surprised how many dev actually put their email in the author, and they're actually a company. And there's an incident a couple of months ago that happened with a company that actually had emails leak through their GitHub, and they also leak internal password that way. So you can even find passwords sometimes for free. Pastebin, same idea. People may just put some things to share with a friend, and they kind of forget that it's public sometimes and indexed by Google. So you can also find it that way. Another really good thing is OWA. Actually, OWA is the devil, pretty much. You can do a lot of amazing stuff with OWA. Most companies are now moving to Office 365, which is the cloud version of it, but there's still super cool feature. OWA on-premise, you can actually leak the GAL, which is the global address list, which contains all the employees. All you need is a password, right? But it's not really hard because people tend to have terrible password. So one of the things that you can do, brute force their password. So assume that you found a list of email. Use the good old season plus the year, so spring 2019, and just spray it against all of them. And you're probably going to find at least one or two accounts. Doesn't really matter if they're privileged or not, because you can use this credential to actually get to the service, which actually have the filter, get people filtered, that going to provide you the list of all their employees. So from there, you can just restart the whole process, but with all of their Active Directory, which is fairly interesting. Cool thing, even if MFA is enabled, so multi-factor authentication is enabled, it's still going to work without it. It basically just supports basic authentication, so it's fairly easy to script it. There's a bunch of tools online that actually do that for you. So targeting OWA is really lucrative. Same approach with Office 365. There's a public API that you can use that achieve pretty much the same thing. So again, you just have to leak a couple of emails, and you can query the API and find the information. Again, you can also perform password brute force on auto-discovery, which is a public domain for all the cloud client. And most of the time, clients don't get inside of the kind of attack that are performed against this domain because it's owned by Microsoft. So it may take a bit of time before they actually realize that their ADFS is actually being brute forced externally, because nobody look at their logs, right? Do you? I don't, personally. Showdown is also really useful. You'll be surprised how many good old Citrix portal, OWA, VPN are actually publicly exposed by your targets. Just use Showdown. All the information is there. You're going to get all what you need. And if it's not a multiple-factor authentication, usually by using the previous information that you got by brute forcing password through OWA, you may find a valuable employee that have a Citrix portal access to a specific application. And from there, you can try to do Citrix escape and stuff like that, and basically get a shell inside of their own network without even having to phish the whole company, which is very interesting because the most critical part is usually the phishing. This is where you have to interact with the user, so you have better chance of being detected at a specific step. So that's a good trick. And as I told you, the good old summer 2018 always going to work, unfortunately, because it's compliant even if your password policy is enforced. Except nobody enforced the special character policy on Active Directory. So even if you know for a fact that your client is enforcing that, just had a bang at the end, and you're still going to get success, unfortunately. And that's a fact. That's the sad part of it. I'm not even joking. So you want to identify which kind of security product your clients have. There's a couple of tricks like that. Most of the security product tend to be verbals. They kind of want to show you that they're there and they're really proud of being there. So they're usually going to have bunch of information that you can actually use. So trying to find an email that is not used anymore, so it has been deactivated by your targeted corp, and send an email to that client. Of course, it's going to bounce back saying that the user does not exist anymore. And look at the SMTP header. You'll be really surprised of all the information that you can find. Here's just 3 simple examples. The first one is the Microsoft technology. So you have like the reputation of the email, and you can confirm that everything is good and didn't detect anything shady with your payload. And even there, you can notify that they don't have SPF enabled, which is another bad thing. Second one is proof point, and you have the scoring of your email. So if you're scoring badly, maybe you should adapt your phishing campaign a bit to make sure that you're going to score better before doing the actual phishing campaign against your client. Last one, good old McAfee. So again, you can know for a fact that they use McAfee technology on the other side, and you can kind of adapt your phishing email to make sure that you're not going to be detected by the solution that they use. Another simple example, LinkedIn, it's your friend. Just look for the kind of job that they're offering. It may help you. So if they're looking for a Splunk admin, Palo Alto, ArcSight, for example, you kind of know what they're probably using on the other side. So again, you can adapt your payload based on this information. Also, their corporate website is really useful to get ideas. Most big companies now, they have like royalty program internally, or they involve in like a charity program and stuff like that. So if you know for a fact that there's an upcoming event in a month, let's say, you can decide to make a phishing campaign based out of this. So it's kind of good in time because it makes sense for them to receive email about that at that specific time. Or if they have loyalty program, you can claim that you changed something in the loyalty program and you have to subscribe there and provide your Active Directory credential on a third-party website, right? It's 100% legitimate. So at that point, let's assume that there's a bunch of other ways to actually perform this part, but let's assume that we collected a good list of email, we have a good idea of our target. Let's move to the actual phishing campaign itself. So here's a couple of rules that I personally follow when I do phishing campaign. The first one, never put your malicious payload in the email. That's really important because you don't get any visibility, and I'll cover this a little bit more in details afterward. Don't allow automated solution to have insight into your final search. So if you know a way to actually prevent automated tools to actually fetch your payload, do it. It's always going to benefit you. Use categorized domain. It's super easy to get categorized domain, and you know for a fact that you're going to go through most proxy that way, so you don't even have to worry that your C2 server may just be not authorized by the corporate proxy. Use HTTPS. There's no reason of not doing it. You're just going to blend with the rest of the encrypted traffic. Be boring as much as possible. And I know that a lot of people don't agree with me on this one, but I personally strongly believe that you should make your phishing campaign as boring as possible and as much corporate as possible. Just personally, I really enjoy the code of conduct thing. Just here's a code of conduct update. Please read it and approve it. Nobody's going to do it. Nobody cares. But you're always going to get 1 or 2 person that's finally going to do it. It may take like 2 days before you get your shell, but at least they're just going to ignore it. If you offer some things to people, usually they're going to be more thrilled and they're going to look at the email and say, oh yeah, I get $50 or something like that in Amazon cart. So they're really going to look at the email and feel like they're looking for someone. So they may catch up and take a look at the email again and may realize that it's fishy and may potentially raise an alert. Especially nowadays, there's a lot of companies that have a phishing button built in like Outlook, for example, so it's fairly easy now to report. Using typo squatting nowadays, I think it's a really bad idea because it's a bit more fishy, and we're living in everything as a services era. So for us, it's pretty common to see like a subdomain like company subdommains such as FireEye.whatever thirdparty.com, because this is now how the internet works. So having this is more legit than like a FireEye with 3E, for example. And don't reuse your domain. As a red teamer and as a company, some of your sample may end up on virus.org because a client may caught you and they may try to analyze it. So you may actually just leak other client information that way, and it's not something that you want to do. So malicious payload. You don't have any insight if it's inside of your payload. You don't know if it was fetched. You don't know which kind of solution potentially fetch it. You have zero control over it. So one of the things that you should do is always put a link that point to a website where your payload is hosted. If like they have a solution that actually fetch your payload, you're gonna know for a fact that the solution fetched the website, so you can fingerprint the IP address and maybe correlate this IP address with the company. If there's something's wrong with your payload for whatever reason, it's easier for you to swap it because you can just change the content of the website on the fly without having to send new phishing campaign with new links. So this is a perfect example. As I mentioned, I'm a personal huge fan of code of conduct update. So you just say, hi, Bob, we currently updated our code of conduct policy. Please just review and accept as soon as possible. And you provide this super corporate link, right, with the UID at the end so you can track your user. That's something that's really important, because if you know for a fact that this ID was tied to a specific user and you see like 3 different IP fetching the same payload, you're probably facing an automated product that is actually trying to understand what's going on with your email. So it may raise a red flag on your side. As you can see here, the URL format is a bit complex, and it tends to be corporate because most of these third party actually have super impossible URL schemes. So I personally use Write Engine, mod rewrite engine, to simply create whatever link I want. So this is a perfect example of a rule that I use, which basically doesn't matter what you put in the URL, it's just always going to redirect to index.php. So you can be as creative as you want. Sometimes I'm even enjoying myself by just adding like ASPX extension, even if it's a PHP server. But it's, I don't know, ASPX sounds more corporate to me than PHP most of the time. So it may actually convince people. Like the devil is in the details, this says, right? So this is a perfect example of like making corporate URL. Rule number 2, as I told you, don't allow an automated tool to actually fetch your final payload. This is a trick that I love a lot. I basically generate the link using JavaScript. Simple as that, because 99% of those products don't actually parse JavaScript. So this is a typical website. So you have your link that point to this website, and the website have a link to this shady word-enabled macro document. And you just click on it. So most of the tools actually going to parse the HTML and found the link and actually get to the payload. And they're going to analyze it and potentially maybe detect you. So if there's a way to actually hide this URL, why not doing it? And JavaScript is exactly the tools that you need. You basically create the link, which is an empty link. So when they're going to crawl the website, they're not going to find anything, and they're just going to forget about this link and says, yeah, there's nothing shady here. That's a perfectly fine website. However, you have your little piece of JavaScript at the end that basically create the location and actually fill the URL for you. And bonus point in this case, as you can see the last line, I'm going to force the click. And phishing is always about the user interaction. If your user enjoyed the experience, it's going to most likely follow through the path. So if you force the download pop-up for him, it's even better, right? He doesn't even have to click on the link. So there's more chance that he's actually going to click and download it. So by doing the click action, you're just going to fetch the page and you're going to be prompted with the download. So that's perfect, right? That's convenient. And Sandbox not going to be able to see that because it's JavaScript generated link. Use categorized domain. Fairly simple. There's a bunch of websites that are already categorized. Personally, I use this little tool, which is like a 4-liner of Bash, which just clone a website and change the base, so I can clone a website, which is an exact copy of the original one, and send it to categorizers such as like Bluecoat, which is actually now Symantec, and a bunch of other company. So they're just going to categorize your domain because, yeah, it's a legitimate, well-known domain. After that, you're good to go, and you can use this domain for phishing or for your C2 connection. You can also unbot for expired domain if you're lazy, like me. So I just wrote this little tool a couple of years ago, which goes on expired domain, and you just give a keyword, and it's going to list a bunch of domains that are actually expired. and you can buy them if they're available. So you can find already categorized demand. And that's another thing. There's some product security product company that actually going to look at the date of registration. So if this domain was there forever, you may actually bypass this check, and they're going to say, oh yeah, this domain has been around for like 10 years, so it's probably safe. Because if you just buy the domain 2 days ago, register it, and they see it in their network, they're going to put a red flag on it, like this domain is freshly registered. It may be shady, right? So this approach can help you with that too. Rule number 4, use HTTPS with a valid certificate. Let's Encrypt is free. Um, right now, unfortunately, not the whole web is actually using this, but I'm pretty sure over time, most of the internet probably going to use Let's Encrypt because it's free. So right now, I've seen some company that actually put a red flag when it's Let's Encrypt because they know it's free and a lot of bad guys are actually using it. But in the future, I'm pretty sure that most of the company are going to rely on Let's Encrypt, so you're just going to be another guy with Let's Encrypt. But you can also afford a paid certificate with like a Rapid SSL or all of the other providers. And bonus point for Let's Encrypt, you don't even have to validate yourself. If you go with corporate solution for certificate, they're going to ask you a bunch of information, and I don't like lying on the internet, so I feel like providing fake information is not something that's really good. Number 5, being boring as possible. Again, as I discussed earlier, if your client have expectation, they're most likely going to reread the email again. And remember the last time, yeah, you have an email saying, hey, you got this 50% discount. I'm pretty sure that most of you look at the URL and say, that may be fishy. Is it something's weird, like they're offering me money or discount on something? Why? Is it a phishing campaign? But if I send you this good old, hey, can you please complete your timesheet? You're like 1 month due and you didn't fill your timesheet. Please just do it and log into the interfaces. You're going to hate it, but you're still going to do it because it's corporate, right? And you want to be a good employee. So that's a perfect example of boring phishing campaign. And personally, I had better success with boring campaign than like those super cool campaign where you're going to get everything you want if you subscribe there. Typo squatting, like for example, NorthSec.io vs NorthSec.CanadianEvent.com, right? If you look at it real fast, it kind of look legitimate. It may be a real domain, but if you're taking a look at it, it's obviously a typo squatting because we're not a NorthSec event, we're NorthSec. But if you look at NorthSec.CanadianEvent.com, it looks way more legitimate, right? It's probably just a Canadian website that have a list of all the Canadian events, for example. We don't know. It sounds legitimate, and NorthSec is spelled correctly, which is another good thing because this is what we're used to. And if you look at third party, for example, you'll see. Just tomorrow, on Monday, when you get back to job, look at your job, look how many different subdomains you're using that are not even related to your company. You'll be actually pretty impressed by how many subdomains you're going to see that are not even related to you. Number 7, don't reuse your domain for other project. Your payload may end up on virus.org because some of your client may detect you, you never know, and you may actually leak other client information, especially if you're using your client name as a subdomain. So they may found DNS record and stuff like that, which is not something that you want because you want to be transparent about that, obviously. Payload. So at that point, we prepare a phishing campaign. We're ready to send a payload to a victim. So I'm just going to take a sip of water before the payload. So the phishing campaign is almost ready. We just need to put a payload inside of a phishing campaign. Nowadays, there's a classic approach. Act differently if you're in front of a security product, which is basically evading sandboxes. But they realized it was not necessarily an efficient model, so they moved to endpoint solution, right? So your client is actually the sandbox itself. But we still found a lot of clients actually have like inline sandbox. So if you can just stop the execution on those sandbox, you're good to go. But there's also a couple of little tricks that you can use on the endpoint to kind of defeat the detection. So I'll cover some of the example that I actually personally do when I do phishing campaign. Just to be clear, I'm going to define my definition of obfuscation and evasion. If you look at the variable equal 3, it's the original code, right? The concept of obfuscating code is to actually have the same result, but written differently. So instead of just putting 3, I'm going to obfuscate it and change it to 1 plus 2. So the result is the same, but if they're performing static analysis and they're looking for the malicious 3, in this case, they're not going to see the 3, right? That's the idea. If you're doing evasion, you're going to use specific condition to actually hack differently. So in this case, let's say if context equals sandbox, so we're fingerprinting the sandbox in a certain way. Okay, fine, you can do 3. If it's not the case, just exit. So in this case, the code never gonna run, and most sandbox will say, yeah, your code is fine, we didn't detect anything suspicious. Being trendy is not necessarily a good thing. For you guys that do red team, you're probably mostly using PowerShell script nowadays because it's the new cool thing. But if you remember a couple of years ago when we used to use Metasploit and all the Metasploit modules that were mostly executable in DLL, we're still achieving the same thing, it's just a different way. But vendor also followed the trend, right? So right now, most of the detection are based out of PowerShell. They're working really hard on detecting PowerShell as much as they can because that's what people use now. What was the last time that you actually heard about someone saying, here's the new cool detection against binary? They don't really care because most people move to PowerShell. So if you come up with other ways of actually executing code on your target, it may actually be super good for you because the chance of being detected are a bit lower. So first advice for the payloads, don't run PowerShell directly. All the vendors gonna detect you in a second because they know that you're gonna use PowerShell. So the minute that you actually start the PowerShell process, they're gonna detect you. They have different level of detection, but there's a tool that I wrote a couple of years ago, which is called Powerless Shell, which is using a technique that was well documented in the past that used C# to actually create a run space environment and execute PowerShell without actually using the PowerShell binary itself. So if you use that, you're going to run whatever PowerShell you want without having to bother executing the PowerShell process itself. If you're using macro, for example, the well-known technique is to rely on wscript.shell or the function called shell itself. The big issue with that is when we're going to actually spawn a child process that is going to be like CMD or whatever you run. And most of the system going to detect the child process of WinWord, which is not what you want, right? The solution that I come up with is use WMI through WinExec, so through your macro, sorry. The idea is your child process not going to be tied to WinWord. It's actually going to be tied to WMI SCPR service, which is actually the WMI service. So there's no link between the execution of your payload and the Word document itself. And I have another tool for that, which is malicious macro generator that generate terribly obfuscated macro that are super useful when you want to phish people. Again, if you're planning to use signed binary, be careful. Again, because they all know about it. It's super trendy. A lot of people discuss about it on Twitter and they post examples. So it's a matter of hours sometimes before the vendor is actually going to have the new rules for those well-known binary. Like regsvr32 was a well-known binary where you can specify a rel to a COM object that you control and it's going to download it and execute it. So you're using like whitelisted signed Windows binary to actually run your code, right? However, I got some insight about the fact that some people found a way to actually run these binary and modify the code, but they're going to remain signed. So I actually wrote a little script that modified the hash of those signed binary, but they're still going to remain signed by Microsoft. So even if you change the data, it's still going to remain signed. So it's fairly interesting because you're still signed. So if your endpoint solution is blacklisting everything that is not signed by Microsoft, you're passing that check. But if they also look at the hash of well-known bad signed binary, you're also going to pass this check. So usually you can actually execute your code using this. The only downside is you have to drop this binary on the system, but it's still something that you can do. So your first stage can be drop this signed binary that was modified like regsvr32, for example. So you drop your modified version of regsvr32. And you actually run the same type of exploit, but with this slightly modified version, and they may not detect you. Another trick that works with some product, again, they have different level of detection, just rename it. PowerShell.exe to something random. Some of them are not even bothering looking at the hash of the binary that you're running. They're just going to look at the name. So just rename it and do your things, and it's still going to work perfectly. Again, you can do it inside of your macro because some software, again, may actually detect that you're going to run the command copy PowerShell and rename it. So just do it inside of your macro if you're using macro as your first attack vector. It's fairly simple. Just copy file, source, destination, and you're good to go. You should always put a condition in your code to evade sandbox. You never know. Maybe even if your OSN didn't reveal any specific security product, just do it. It costs nothing and it may save your life. Perfect example, when I use click once, the way that click once work, at the end of the day, it's just an executable, but Microsoft come up with a super cool, user-friendly way of delivering them through Internet Explorer. So you click on the link and you have this super cool, fancy setup that just starts, so people feel like, I guess it's more safe that way, right, for whatever reason. But if your payload is fetched by a security product, they're usually just going to get the binary and they're going to run it. So an easy check for click once, check if Internet Explorer is actually running. Because if there's a click once running on the system and Internet Explorer is not open, it's impossible. Like there's something shady going on, you're probably like in a sandbox or something like that. So in this case, in C#, you can just check for the process, and if it's the case, if Internet Explorer is running, you can be evil as much as you want after that. Again, I have a tool which is called Click Once Generator that allow you to generate those fancy click once, heavily obfuscated things, and you have all the option to actually specify which kind of process you want to look for. Another one that is really interesting to look for is Outlook. Obviously, if you know for a fact that you're using the FAT client, so if someone's actually reading your email and Outlook is not open, again, it sounds a bit shady to me. Payload, again, sometimes you have issue and you're facing a specific client and you have to come up with a solution because you know that they're going to detect this specific type of payload. So sometimes, time to time, I just write tools to actually try to evade them. So the first one is for COM scriptlet, so SCT file. If you want to use like Cobalt Strike or Empire built-in SCT file, you can just send the file through SCT obfuscator, and it's just going to make it a bit more obfuscated, and usually you're good to go. UniBAV is actually an exe obfuscator, sorry, and it just takes shellcode and gonna generate an exe for you that is heavily obfuscated, and you should be good to go again. It also support a bunch of evasion modules, so you can actually specify which module you want to use. Don't kill my cat. I presented that tool last year at the NorthSec. Actually, it's relying on polyglot images, so it's a 100% valid image, but it's also a 100% valid shellcode if you start from the first byte of the image. So over the network, you're just going to see an image, and most of the sandbox product don't really care about an image, right? Because they don't want to lose their CPU cycle analyzing a legitimate image, right? For PowerShell, there's my friend that is actually presenting at the same time from FireEye. He wrote invoke obfuscation. He's actually presenting DOS obfuscation as we speak. And this is a heavy framework that had obfuscation to your code. But if you're using Cobalt Strike or Empire, you may realize that most of the time, if you have the one-liner, it's just going to be a one-liner base 64 encoded, right? And most of the product now, they actually fingerprint that specific path. So I just wrote a little simple tools that actually obfuscate the base 64 itself. So it's more convenient for this kind of specific tools. But feel free to just take a look at my GitHub and just see how it works. If you're interested in more details, I can provide you after the presentation. Problem with the sandbox, they're fingerprintable and predictable, right? Because you know for a fact that this is not a real environment. This is something that is faking an environment and trying to see what's going on with your malware. So there's a lot of trick that you can actually use to prevent your code to run on sandboxes. For example, look at the memory size. If it's less than 4 gig, you're probably living in the past if it's less than 4 gigs, or you're a sandbox, because nowadays 4 gigs on a computer is pretty legitimate. Same with the disk size. If you have less than 250 gigs of disk size, you're probably not a legitimate computer. You're just a sandbox. Again, there are some sandbox that have that fake disinformation, but there's other way to look at that. You can also look at the hook that they've created, number of CPU, same thing. I don't even know if it's possible to buy a single CPU anymore. Probably not. You're probably gonna have at least 2 core. So that's another thing that you can check. I'm assuming even 4 is probably good in 2018. Again, as I mentioned, look for a specific process running. If you're phishing someone and you don't see Outlook exe running, that's probably not your original target. Uh, Difference between endpoint and your actual sandbox, network access. Is your sandbox have network access? That's another easy one. Oh yeah, here's my payload and you don't have network access. How my payload actually ended up there? So that's some things that you can assess pretty easily. If you're targeting a company, usually they're going to be joined to the domain. So you can check if the current user that is running your payload is joined to a domain. If it's not the case, that's probably not, again, the target that you're looking for. Time zone. If you're targeting a Canadian company and you know exactly on which time zone they are, there's no reason to have like a weird time zone in a different country, right? So it may be another sign of you're running your code in a shady environment. Detecting hook, there's a bunch of sandboxes that actually have hooks, and they're gonna fake some answers. So if you ask for a specific Windows API, they may force an answer, but there's actually a way to actually detect hook, so you can actually detect that the function was hook and just abort if it's the case. Uptime, for example, if you're targeting someone during the after lunch and the computer was open for like 5 seconds, maybe it's another shady sandbox that just fired up. Activities, look at the clipboard, look at the network traffic that you're receiving. If the clipboard is empty, that may be the case, but usually people are like copy pasting stuff all day long. So if it's empty, that's another good sign of the fact that you're probably looking at a sandbox right now. And there's like billions of other techniques, and we can talk about this for probably 6 hours. But be creative. That's the key. And don't be shy to actually play with those sandboxes and trying to figure out how they work. You're going to benefit from that. Rule number 5. Connecting back to your C2 as stealthy as possible. There's a lot of techniques that were publicly disclosed lately, like domain fronting. So use a legitimate domain to actually front your C2 domain is something quite cool, because your client going to see traffic to a legitimate, let's say, Microsoft website. And from there, you can actually send the data back to your C2. So it's kind of hard to actually figure out what's going on from a IR perspective. A little bit harder, at least. Categorize domain, again, I think we covered this one pretty well. Enforce HTTPS, again, there's no reason for you to not use HTTPS. You're gonna blend into the rest of the HTTPS traffics, and most companies don't perform SSL interception, so they're gonna have zero visibility on what's going on. Also, select legitimate protocol. In the past, like Metasploit, if you look, for example, they used to do all the traffic over raw TCP that was actually encrypted. But most rats nowadays actually move to HTTP because they just want to blend into legitimate traffic. So again, using HTTP for your own rat is probably a good idea if you want to write your own. Which brings me to Thundershell, which is a rat that I wrote couple of months ago, and again, it was to solve an issue on a specific engagement. One of the idea that the issue that we had is the endpoint solution was actually analyzing the network traffic using a mini filter, which is basically a filter that you can put on the network traffic. So even if you use HTTPS, when it hit the target, the traffic is going to be decrypted at the OS level, right? So you still have visibility on the clear text traffic. So if you have your stager, they're actually going to see it in clear. So the solution was to come up with a second layer of encryption that is not performed at the OS level, but at the software level. So Thundershell is actually encrypting everything using RC4. So when the target receives the traffic, it's RC4 encrypted, which doesn't give any information to the mini filter because it's just gibberish. And the PowerShell rat actually performed the decryption at that point. So the network has no visibility on this actual traffic. Another thing that I wanted to address is the fact that most of these rats have a second stage. So you're going to have your shellcode, which is the first shellcode that's going to fetch the remote DLL or exe that's going to be loaded in memory, then it's going to be executed. The problem with that is most of these solutions actually going to send the second stage clear over network, so you're going to see like this shady Cobalt Strike DLL going through the network, which is not necessarily something that you want. So by doing RC4 encryption and avoiding having a second stage, you're pretty much good to go again. So this is basically the schema of how the Thundershell rat works. So you use RC4 encryption, send over HTTPS, Windows decrypt the HTTPS stream, then the network is at that position, and PowerShell rat actually decrypt the RC4 after the hook was set, so they have zero visibility. Again, it just doesn't download the second stage, which is a good thing. And feel free to contribute to the project. I wish it can become something useful for more than just me. So if you feel, I'm actually working on a web UI right now to make it as much convenient as possible, but feel free to actually join me in that project if you're interested. It will be a pleasure to work with you. Choose the right payload. For example, if you look at Office 2016, by default, the macro are disabled. So you can try as hard as you want, the client not going to be able to actually run it. So trying to avoid macro if you know for a fact that your client is using Office 2016. HTA, it's super powerful, but it's also highly detected because it's extremely trendy. A lot of people talk about it, and it's fairly cool. A click once require the use of Internet Explorer, and I've hit a case where the whole shop was using Google Chrome, and they didn't know how to use Internet Explorer, so they were just trying to load the click once using Chrome, which was not really successful for me. Plain text exe may be blocked by application whitelisting, so depending on which kind of fingerprint you manage to do on your client, you may actually avoid using one of these specific payload because you're going to get detected or it's actually just not going to run. Again, avoid running PowerShell directly too because it's extremely trendy. So for example, instead of doing macro that actually launch a WMI that launch PowerShell, use macro that launch WMI that actually use PowerShell less to load the PowerShell without actually ever invoking PowerShell.exe. That's those little things that actually make a huge difference at the end of the day between being detected or not. So at this point, we carefully crafted our phishing campaign and our payload, so we're pretty much ready to go, right? So good news, everyone. We have a shell at that point. So it's time for hunting. So now we have access. We need to gather as much information as possible. And usually, you never know. Maybe you think you went through and you were super stealth, but they actually have good detection, and they actually detected you. So as fast as possible, I'm always going to try to fetch as much information about the internal user base. So I'm going to fetch the username, the email, and everything I can to make sure that I can collect this information and potentially redo a phishing campaign later on with a bigger pool of information. So again, avoid using running PowerShell directly. Avoid using net family command because there's a lot of detection-based rules that are purely based on the function that you're going to call. So if you call net user or something, there's a good chance that you may be detected if they have detection for that. Try to avoid connecting to all systems at the same time if it's possible because it's pretty bad and super noisy. The solution, if you want to get the information as fast as possible, personally, I use unmanaged PowerShell plus LDAP query. You can just send an LDAP query to the Active Directory and get all the information. For Cobalt Strike, PowerPick is the equivalent of managed PowerShell, and it's built in. So there's no reason to not doing it. ThunderShell by default support this too. So every time that you're actually invoking PowerShell, you're actually using the unmanaged PowerShell idea. So if you look at this script, I have a commandlet which is called dump user email, which actually just ended up doing a LDAP query. So it's going to look for all the users in the LDAP directory and get the mail property. That's all. You're going to get all the mail without having to use SMB or anything else. You're just going to query LDAP directly. And this is usually some things that companies do not monitor. Same with username. You want all the username, same query, just different property. There's other option like more that can provide you more information about the users that you're looking for. If you're feeling a bit more crazy, if I can put it that way, you can actually try to brute force users. After you fetch the list of users, if you feel like you want to brute force all of these users, why not? So I actually wrote another script that allow you to pass a list of user and the password. And the cool thing about this script is you can actually brute force user in other forests inside of the enterprise. You just have to specify the domain that you're looking for. So you can be in domain A and actually brute force users in domain B. Works pretty well. It's obviously a bit more noisy because every time you're trying to a login attempt, you're going to generate an event. Of course, try to avoid brute forcing more than 2 times the same user because you may log all the account. This is not something super stealth, especially if you don't want to be detected. But it can be really useful if you're running out of idea at the end of a red team that went super well. Just out of curiosity, the brute force thing relied on a validate credential, which is a built-in functionality in Windows. and it just connects to the DC and asks if the credential are valid or not. That's all. If you're looking for a specific SAM account name, let's say you went on LinkedIn and you found this specific user that seems to be really interesting. There's actually a little script that I, again, wrote, which is called search full name to SAM account. You just provide a name, and they're going to return the information that it's actually inside of the Active Directory again. So in this case, I search for myself inside of the FireEye domain, and as you can see, I just specify Hamilton, and my name come out. So you can get the SAM account name, and you can potentially try to find where this actually is currently logged in based on the SAM account name, right? There's a really cool feature. You're probably familiar with tools such as Invoke User Hunter, which basically connect as to assets that it's actually alive in the network, and they're gonna try to see who's actually running on the system, right? It's super useful, but extremely noisy too. This technique is a bit less stealth. It only connects to the main controller and look for the event log and the logon event for the user that you're targeting. The only downside is that you need to have domain admin access at that point. However, usually the way that I'm proceeding is my first goal is to get domain admin, and from there I'm going to move to a specific target that have access to the application I'm targeting. So at that point in my red team, I already have domain admin, so it's not really an issue for me. So you just specify your user and wait for the event log to show up, and you're going to have a bunch of like logon event that show you the source IP, so you can easily find where the user is actually connected at the moment, so you can target that system later on. Browser bookmark is really useful too. By default, they may push this information in their bookmark, so all their corporate asset may be actually found in the bookmark. So if you're looking for their intranet and stuff like that, you may actually find it there. Again, there's another little PowerShell script that can do that for you. WDigest. Mimikatz sometimes may not work because they may have prevented WDigest to be stored in memory. The cool thing about PowerShell, by default, it supports Kerberos tickets. So if you have access to PowerShell, you actually have access to the current user Kerberos ticket. And I wrote a little script which is called remote WMI execute that allow you to execute command on a remote host using your current user Kerberos ticket. So assuming that the user that you currently have access to other system, such as a local admin user or something like that, you can just leverage that power to move laterally on the network without actually knowing any one password. There's a little downside about Kerberos tickets. Sometimes, even if you have a Kerberos ticket, you're going to get access denied. There's a catch-22 with the Kerberos ticket. Depending on which process you're actually using, your Kerberos ticket may not be in refresh, so it's just going to time out and never going to be actually renewed. So it's really important to actually pick the right process when you're performing that kind of task. So especially if you're using WMI, this is one of the process that actually gonna not necessarily renew your Kerberos ticket. So one of the things that I do, again, it's a bit noisy, but sometimes we have to be noisy to make sure that we're in a good position. I'm gonna migrate to Explorer. So I'm gonna inject myself into Explorer and impersonate everything that is running under the Explorer context. I'm also gonna enter it from the Kerberos ticket, obviously. So that's my go-to process, but unfortunately, Explorer is not a process that really performs network traffic, so it's some things that it's shady. Apparently, on Windows 10 now, Explorer is actually having tabs and do perform network connections, so it makes this technique a bit less shady. Again, from an OPSEC perspective, it's not necessarily the best process to use. However, there's more stealthy target that you can use, such as SVC, also canals that are process that actually perform network traffic. So keep that in mind in the future. So you can migrate to these processes, and it's a bit more stealth because they're known to perform network traffic. Active Directory contains a lot of valuable information. There's probably like 200 or 300 fields for each user, so you'll be surprised of all the information that you can find. And actually have a bunch of utility that can dump the comment, the description, and you'll be surprised how many times we found actual hard-coded password in the command for like service account and stuff like that. So just dump all the comments, and you'll be surprised. Sometimes, hey, don't change this password for this specific service account, and usually having a service account is usually really useful from a red team perspective. There's also legacy software that created the user password field in your Active Directory, which literally stored the user password in clear. So you may actually found that one too. As I mentioned earlier, you don't necessarily need admin privileges to achieve all your predefined goal with your clients. So if it's an option, you can try and avoid it, because most of the noise that you're going to make is to find the right person that have domain admin right at the beginning. So if you can avoid that part and just target the specific user that you're looking for, it may actually save you from being detected. Unfortunately, red team and real life are a bit different because we're limited in time and budget, right? So the client is paying for your service, so sometimes we have to hack fast because we're just running out of budget or time. So we may have to take risky decision, but you have to be careful and make sure that you're taking the risky decision for the right reason. Like as we mentioned earlier, migrating to Explorer is probably something that can be done fairly stealthy and may be extremely valuable for you. Most Windows command can be run through PowerShell. That's another thing. Most of the framework just going to spawn CMD, but you can actually use unmanaged PowerShell to run typical CMD commands such as netstat or stuff like that. So you can use PowerPick from CobaltStrike or PowerShell support that by default. So at least you're not going to have event, hey, this command has been run, and you're not going to get alerts for that. That's another good. These are not super stealthy trick, but way useful. My favorite one is find local admin access. It's actually super noisy, but it's damn useful. The way it works is going to connect to all the assets and trying to see if the current user have access to the system with local admin privileges. It's so useful because you don't even have to find a local privilege escalation on your current system. If you don't want to, you can just move on to a next one where you actually privilege. So you don't even have to bother doing this. Get net domain trust is actually super powerful too. You're going to get all the domains, so you may actually find cross-domain policies that leak other users that are actually privileged in your own domain, even if you don't know about it. Same with the net forest trust. You'll be surprised like how many bidirectional trusts we found all the time that are so useful. Invoke share finder. Looking for share with valuable information too is something that's really useful. And get net local group again. If you're looking for a local admin remotely on a system, you can just ask the remote system to give you the list of everything that is considered a local admin. So it's going to include Active Directory group and local user that also have access to it. So this is something that's really useful. But unfortunately, they're mostly extremely noisy because they're going to connect to most systems and generate a lot of network traffic. So in conclusion, even if we try to be as stealthy as possible, there's no real way to exfiltrate data without creating some noise at some point. So you just have to choose your battle and decide, okay, I consider this specific part of my action to be noisy, but they may seem legitimate from a network perspective. But when it's possible, trying to adapt your technique and your tool to remain as stealthy as possible with your client. So again, I kind of give you some advice. I hope they're going to be useful for you in the future, especially if you're performing red team. But you can use these advice to actually get more data without creating much noise. So a good phishing campaign make a difference. Trying to target your company, look at what they like. Crafting a payload isn't hard. So take your time. Don't rush yourself. Trying to learn, and that's one of the reasons why I wrote all of these tools. I just wanted to have a better understanding, and the best way to learn is by doing it yourself. And again, trying to avoid running PowerShell directly at all costs. I think I probably said that 20 times during the presentation, but that's a fact. It's really important to actually do that because it's easy to detect people that way. That's pretty much it for me. So hope you enjoy it. If you don't have any question, I guess I'll take some now.